Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining Environmental Defense Fund for this conversation during Florida Climate Week. We are so grateful to all of you for spending time with us today and to the Volo Foundation for hosting this important dialogue throughout the week to really hone in on the biggest challenges and opportunities around climate change, particularly for the Sunshine State. My name is Dawn Sheriffs, and I am the Florida Director for the Environmental Defense Fund. If you're not familiar with EDF, as we like to call it, we are a global organization that really focuses on finding pragmatic solutions to the world's most pressing environmental challenges, and we have been doing that since 1967. We have offices across the globe and are laser focused on addressing climate change. I am so excited to have with me today Elizabeth Gore, our Senior Vice President of Political Affairs. She brings decades of experience working in Washington, D.C., and has been absolutely pivotal in helping advance EDF's policy priorities. Prior to her time with EDF, Elizabeth served senior positions in both the U.S. House of Representatives, the Office of Management and Budget, and the U.S. Senate. She has always focused on energy and environmental policy. She's also had a period of work in the private sector representing all different energy and environmental interests. So she is the perfect person to help us walk through some important legislation today. Thank you, Elizabeth, and welcome.
Well, thanks, Dawn. I'm glad to be here.
So I think most people have heard that over the past 12 months, Congress has passed two landmark bills, both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and then more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act. And these can both be pretty wonky names to start with, but together, these two bills have hundreds of billions of dollars of investments that will both reduce emissions, protect the health of families and children, and invest in communities. One article I noticed by the National Geographic actually said that together, the proposed upgrades, even to our electrical grid in the Inflation Reduction Act, is considered the government's greatest investment for energy programs since 1942. So we're talking, 80 years since we have made a move, this exciting. But obviously, there's a lot to break down. And so I'm hoping that we can spend our time together today talking about how these two pieces of policy will lead to less pollution. How are they actually going to lower costs for families and businesses, and what this is going to look like for future generations? I know it's going to be a lot of content, and hopefully we won't get, too wonky, but it is two different bills that do come together. That said, just to try to break it down and keep things a little bit simple, maybe we can start with just talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. Some folks may know, but this bill passed in early August and has a wide range of policies and funding for pro-climate programs. Can you talk a little bit about how this bill even came together?
Yeah, well, it was a long, tangled process, that's for sure. People have described it as a roller coaster with ups and downs and twists and turns. And just like a roller coaster, it was exciting and exhilarating, and sometimes made us all just a little bit nauseous as well. But listen, many times this process was declared dead because of the convoluted way that it came together. And yet there was a persistence among climate allies and stakeholders to keep pushing because these policies are needed and they're popular. In 2020, 2/3 of Americans said that the government should go further in confronting climate change. And that persistence that we've seen has really paid dividends. So let me back up just a little bit. At the very start of the Biden administration, there were a number of key priorities that the White House was pushing. And a little more than a year ago, these two bills that you mentioned, the Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, they were actually moving together in tandem. And so the two bills are very much complementary to each other. And in large part, that was by design because of their origin story, because they started out together. Now, back in December of 2021, these two bills broke apart when Congress passed the infrastructure piece, which was a really important climate investment and a climate accomplishment. But the Senate didn't have the votes to pass that Inflation Reduction Act, or as it was referred to back then, the Build Back Better Act. So these bills started together and then broke apart. And when that happened, we went into a period, the beginning of this year, where there was a lot of frustration about that second piece, that second chapter of the book. It felt stalled out to a lot of people that were working on it. There were occasional glimpses of progress, but it was pretty slow going. But I will say, EDF did not give up. Our friends at other environmental nonprofits didn't give up. And our allies in the Hill didn't give up. And it turned out that this period that seemed so slow and it seemed like nothing much was happening was really crucial to our success, even though we didn't know it at the time. During those several months in early 2022, we worked tirelessly to polish and improve and perfect all of the various climate pieces of what became the Inflation Reduction Act. There were countless versions of these different pieces, and we were engaging with all different stakeholders, the business community, community leaders, staff, and members on Capitol Hill. And we were unified as an environmental community so that when this language could become really greased and ready to go. We really invested time and energy and lots of money to build political support and momentum for the bill also. So what that meant was that when the dam broke, when Senator Schumer announced towards the end of July that he and Senator Manchin had a climate deal, the Senate, not known exactly for its speed sometimes, took a vote about 10 days later on August 7th. And it turned out that all of the policy and political work that went on behind the scenes for months and months, when it wasn't even clear that the bill would be or whether it would move forward, all of that work meant that the provisions were ready to go and they could be dropped into the package when the opportunity came up. So all of that legwork on negotiating and vetting and debating those provisions had already occurred. And so those provisions were ready to go and could be plugged in with little drama through a process that was very dramatic. So the House passed that bill a few days later, and then the president signed it on August 16th, which was less than 3 weeks after the Schumer-Manchin announcement. And it's a big deal. The head of the International Energy Agency, who's a European economist, said this bill is the single most important climate action since the Paris Agreement. And many people have called it transformational or revolutionary in its impact. So it was a big victory, a little bit of a surprise twist at the end that brought it all together, but a great step forward in our fight against climate change.
Having worked in public policy for a long time, I can tell everybody it's really more of an endurance sport.
Yes.
But I think that everybody sort of stayed the course, was really meaningful. I'd love to sort of maybe dig into a little bit more about, why are we seeing these two bills as revolutionary? What do they really do to tackle climate?
So there's a couple of reasons why they are so have the potential to be so impactful, why people call them revolutionary or transformational. The scale of the investments in this bill, as well as the breadth of issues that are tackled in them, is what makes this so special from a climate perspective. So taken together, these two bills invest about $500 billion in addressing climate change. And this includes significant tax credits to decarbonize the power sector, which is, of course, a key piece to any plan that addresses climate change. And similarly, this plan jumpstarts the effort to reduce harmful emissions from the transportation sector, And that approach, the transportation sector approach, is holistic. It includes 500,000 new charging stations and incentives for additional charging infrastructure above that. It includes subsidies for medium and heavy duty trucks, as well as electric school buses and even electric ferries. And this is in addition to the tax credits that have gotten kind of the most discussion, the most press, which are intended to accelerate the transition of light duty vehicles to non-emitting. So the whole transportation sector is very broad. The entire package also addresses other aspects of the climate crisis by providing investments in sustainable agriculture and conservation, provisions to bolster domestic supply chain for our burgeoning green economy. The bill includes funds to engage with communities to promote equity in those places that have borne the brunt of pollution. And for the very first time, a price on pollution is included in the form of a fee on methane emissions. So it's really the combination of the high level of investment and the range of investments across the economy. The last thing I'd say is that the provisions are long-term, at least 10 years, which means that they provide durability and certainty so that you can see real investments from states, cities, and the business community.
You know, I've wrestled a lot with the back and forth about how to talk about impact. We talk about carbon reduction, we talk about metric tons, and we talk about different baseline years and what are the goals. And it honestly is confusing even to those of us whose job it is to understand it. So I thought maybe we just take a quick second. I have a graph I'm going to try to share here that maybe is just going to help folks understand how this new legislation puts us as the US kind of on track with the Paris Agreement. Let's see, and this is an image I am generously borrowing from our friends at Rhodium Group. But you can sort of see when we look at what the target levels were and how we are now poised to get there as a result of the Inflation Reduction, this huge difference in what was possible. Back when the US Paris Agreement was first, signed, we had no real understanding of how we were going to get there. And now we can see a real path to achieving that goal.
We've talked about how this bill really has changed the baseline. And this chart shows that pretty clearly. It fundamentally shifts downward what we see as our emissions trajectory. And that is, that's what makes it transformational.
Yeah, great. Well, thinking about that, the provisions are for this bill, we're looking at 10 years, right? So this is transformation that starts immediately, but we're going to be able to sort of keep the energy going, the momentum going. And I think that that's really important, particularly as we talk about how it impacts, the private sector. They need some regulatory certainties in order to make decisions. There's been some interesting conversations about what is anticipated. There's certainly the federal investment, but how will private investment get unlocked as a result of this legislation?
It's a great question. The actions by Congress are really important because they will spur a virtuous cycle of investment. That is, the durability and the certainty created by these laws mean that businesses can have the confidence to make their own major investments. And we've already seen this unfolding. So since this law was signed, a company called First Solar has announced $1 billion in investments in the US. $1 billion. Toyota has committed $2.5 billion for electric vehicles. Ford has committed $3.5 billion. A company called Hertz Rent-A-Car, well-known name across America, has said it's going to transition its fleet to electric cars. These are investments that are being made because we're helping to push the economy towards this tipping point where people have confidence to move towards electrification of the transportation sector. Bloom Energy, Bosch, and others have committed hundreds of millions of dollars each on clean hydrogen technology. And we haven't even talked about the tens of billions of investments from the recently passed CHIPS bill. That bill was focused on semiconductor chips, but also had a big bucket of money for investments in R&D and innovation. So that's critical to climate progress, because all of these new electric cars, all of these new technologies need computer chips. That's critical to climate progress because all these new electric cars and other new technologies need computer chips. So companies are now racing to open new chip factories in the US. And the legislation catalyzed these investments, which then amplify the impact of the government investments, which then create new opportunities for private sector investments. So as I said, it's helped to create a tipping point so that the investments in the bill are reinforced and expanded in their impact by the private sector investments.
So I'm just going to geek out on one more chart over here because
I love the charts.
when you start mixing millions and billions of dollars, it really is outside the scope of what most of us can sort of think through, right? I'm more keeping an eye on, my kitchen table bills, but this was a great graphic. We've got a fantastic team of economists in-house at EDF, and I stole this from that team, but it was really pronounced. I mean, you can hear the data point of you will unleash 10 times more investment from the private sector. But when you look at how, 39 billion catalyzes 385 billion, I would like that return on investment for everything in my retirement portfolio.
That's right.
And it is very unlikely to happen. But this, it really is going to be an interesting economic generator across sectors.
Absolutely. And I think that it also suggests the kind of job creation we're looking at and the kind of economic development that we'll be seeing nationwide. It definitely is a catalyst. That's the right word to describe it.
One of the things that I was pleasantly surprised to see, but a little bit surprised certainly, was that there was really strong support from utilities that are, familiar to those of us in Florida, like Duke Energy, NextEra, which down here is Florida Power and Light. But there was a lot of utilities that came out in support of the Inflation Reduction Act. And they're now really ramping up their plans to make investments in renewables. And that's really interesting because it's not just about cutting emissions. It's actually about reducing costs for customers. We see the long-term cost benefits of moving to a renewable energy. And I think especially, as things globally have become, there's been more conflict, you feel those effects almost immediately. So this is really a path for the United States' energy independence too.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, the key difference for this bill is the longevity of it. These renewable tax provisions, historically, they've just been extended for 2 or sometimes 3 years at a time. They expire and then they get extended retroactively. It's not a regime that encourages the big investments that these utilities need to make if they're going to make a strong pivot towards renewable power. And so this bill is different in that it creates that certainty with this long-term extension. And that has been a game changer in terms of providing the running room to these utilities to make the investments that are needed.
Even beyond the utilities, it sounds like this is kind of a game changer for all business sizes. We've got in Florida, about 380,000 manufacturing workers. If we're going to be able to ramp up some of these new chip manufacturing and other domestic manufacturing in support of clean energy, that means good paying jobs here that we don't have to sort of, worry about going elsewhere, right? We're really going to build longstanding, high paying jobs for our communities. And that's something that, is a little bit different for Florida, who's very long, a large part of the economy has been around tourism, which aren't the highest paying, gigs in town. I think clean energy workers are already ramping up. We have 158,000 in the state. That's second in the country in terms of, folks working for producing clean energy. That's all going to go up, even in the energy efficiency space. So these are specific industries and sectors for, production and clean energy. But there's provisions of the bill that drive down things like healthcare costs and that improve supply chains. So all different types of businesses that may have nothing to do with manufacturing clean energy will actually see benefits.
Absolutely. There's an intersectionality around the different provisions of the bill, which I again think helps to reinforce the goals of the bill and help to advance them. One thing I would mention is the bill includes hundreds of millions of dollars for new staff to process permitting from the federal government. Now, this is not an fascinating or sexy provision of the bill, but you know what? It's a practical investment that makes a real difference in terms of engaging and deploying new technology, new projects to reduce emissions. And so one of the real strengths of this bill is that it includes lots of different provisions that all reinforce each other in terms of advancing our climate goals.
It's really interesting. Maybe I want to pivot into sort of one area we haven't really touched on much yet, which is transportation. And, for folks in Florida that may be, watching this week, hurricanes are top of mind. And EDF's Florida team, works in a very focused way on getting medium and heavyweight fleets converted to electric vehicles. It is more cost effective, whether you're in the private sector or these are government fleets. But they're also really valuable from emergency evacuation standpoint. So one of our goals that we've been working with the state of Florida and the Florida Department of Transportation with is actually to get 4 or more fast chargers that would get these big guys, not my next door neighbor's Tesla, but the really big vehicles that are honestly doing a lion's share of the pollution anyway, right? But if we can get the charging stations set up about 4 or more for every 100 miles along those emergency evacuation routes, we're going to be better able to prepare people before a storm, because gas stations going empty is usually the first thing that happens, followed by water. And then after a storm, people will be able to sort of come back in quickly and resupply whatever needs, the impacted communities are having. And so, we've been working a lot in that space. There's some great news. But just last month, the governor and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection announced the set aside of $68 million from the Volkswagen settlement to purchase 227 electric buses. That's major progress, right? But we also know we've got 18,000 school buses emitting pollution. So we have a long way to go. Can you talk a little bit about how these bills will help on that side of getting our EV goals, met?
I can, yeah. So first of all, I think it's terrific that the state has these ambitious targets. That helps to orient the state and all the agencies to move towards a common goal. And so I commend Florida for its focus on moving in this direction. And the legislation that's been passed over the last year will help the goals be more achievable. First of all, there are more resources available to help incentivize the purchase of electric vehicles, and there's more dollars available to build out charging infrastructure. Families can secure up to $7,500 in rebates for buying a new electric vehicle. And for the first time, there's also incentives for used vehicles that can help lower income families have access for the very first time to the long-term savings of electric vehicle ownership. So a couple different provisions for light duty vehicles for individuals. A second, from a larger perspective, the commitments in the bills have driven the private investment that we talked about. I talked about some of the car companies and the billions of dollars that they're investing. And by ramping up the scale of EVs, again, we create this virtuous cycle that drives prices down for both electric vehicles and charging stations, which is going to drive better, uptake by individuals and companies, which will in turn increase broader production and lower prices still. So these incentives are helping businesses to install even more EV chargers. That helps address some of the range anxiety that folks have. So a lot of different things in this bill help to transition towards electric vehicles. You talked a bit about the medium and heavy duty side. It's a really good point. This has been a focus for EDF, as you mentioned, and we worked really hard to make sure that the policies in these two bills were broad enough to cover those types of vehicles. It really hasn't gotten as much emphasis in terms of incentives over the last couple of years. And because those trucks and buses cause a disproportionate amount of pollution, it's really important that we address it, especially in these urban areas. And there's an environmental justice aspect of it too. The communities around, throughways or ports or inner city urban areas, those communities have borne a disproportionate burden of transportation pollution. And so electrifying that part of the economy has a huge impact on those communities. So we see that as another important part of the bill.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Asthma numbers in those communities are just terrifying.
Yes.
So keeping the focus here in Florida, I think there's a desire to sort of get folks' heads wrapped around individual sort of things, like,
Yeah.
what do dollars to the state of Florida really look like? Do you have any examples?
I do. I mean, the infrastructure bill, which was passed and signed into law at the end of 2021, those funding streams have already started to move, and Florida has been successful in securing a good amount of funds from that particular bill. And then there's going to be more coming now that the Inflation Reduction Act has been enacted. But so far, billions of dollars of funding have been announced. Florida has 10 specific projects that have been identified for funding. This year alone, Florida will receive over $2 billion for transportation to invest in roads and bridges, public transport, seaports, airports, and then an additional $275 million for clean water. Another critical infrastructure piece that many states have been focused on in recent years. So far, about $95 million has been allocated to Florida just this year for weatherization, and another $15 million to help prevent outages and make the power grid more resilient. Again, Dawn mentioned the hurricane season, and this resilience is incredibly important and can be life-changing, life-saving for households in Florida. Overall, Families could save up to $1,800 per year if they took advantage of all the different tax credits and rebates that have been made available through these bills. The other investment that I would focus on, something near and dear to the hearts of many Floridians, and that's $1 billion that was awarded to the Army Corps of Engineers for the Everglades. The funds will be used for ecosystem restoration activities, and it is one of the single largest investments in Everglades history, a really critical part of the ecosystem down there in South Florida. There's a bunch of other provisions in here that benefit individuals directly. Tax credits for improving energy efficiency and appliances. We think the numbers that I've seen have shown that utility bills could go down over 11% per year for Florida residents. Again, it's the confluence of all of these different provisions coming together. The tax credits are also help to lower the price of solar energy. We've talked about Florida as a sunshine state. Those credits are going to lower utility costs for people in a state like Florida. And then Dawn's talked about the electric school buses. EDF worked really hard to push those school buses out, and Florida has been a leader in this space. And now counties have an additional pot of money that was contained in that infrastructure law that they can leverage for even more electric school buses. It's a big transformation. These fleets are really large, so it's going to take a staged approach. But these two bills are going to go a long way in pushing these dollars out to states like Florida and to counties across your state.
It's so wild to me that we can be talking about having this significant global impact in climate reductions and not lose sight of the fact that $1,800 a year is real money to families that are struggling to make ends meet right now. I mean, especially as natural gas prices have resulted in multiple rate hikes on electric bills for Floridians. We already pay down here about 15% more per capita on our energy bills because of the heat, because we are running our air conditioners more. That's only going to go up as climate continues to ramp up the heat for our state. And then that's really been compounded because the natural gas market has been so volatile that in 2021 we saw rate hikes. One by Florida Power and Light that's top of mind was looking to increase rates 20% over 4 years. An average family paying $150 to $200 in August, that's a significant rate hike. We now know that in 2022, because of the increase in natural gas prices, there's going to be another $3.4 billion in rate hikes proposed to the Florida Public Service Commission because the utilities are looking to recover their costs. And the state is deeply over reliant on natural gas for 75% of its energy production. So this was really, it's kind of been this spiral of cost. So knowing that we can get these rebates, get these incentives, and then actually over the long term, lower our energy costs by 11% is, really can't be underestimated. And I think it's, there's going to be families that can take advantage of solar. We were very fortunate. I just, actually in anticipation of not being sure whether or not the solar credits would be extended, we pulled the trigger just a year ago to move on getting our own solar installed while it was still accessible to us. And it's really helpful to know that that's going to be available to more and more families. But even just the costs that will be reduced for utility scale solar is going to help low income families who previously really didn't benefit from energy efficiency programs because they didn't own their house. They weren't in a position to make some structural costs. And in states like New York, it is well known that it is a legal requirement to provide heat in affordable housing units. Unfortunately, in Florida, and this shocks a lot of folks, there is no legal requirement for air conditioning in affordable housing. And that's a real threat to health, especially amongst the medically vulnerable and the elderly. Now those families will be able to maximize these incentives and try to get, some of that air conditioning in places where they may not have otherwise been able to. So, I think it's exciting to me that folks across the economic spectrum will experience access to better benefits.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce one of the points that you make. You talked about the volatility of natural gas prices. And, we see volatility in oil prices that drives, these big swings in gasoline prices. Moving towards a green economy, towards more renewable power, towards electrification of transportation, that really helps because it disconnects our costs from these volatile fossil fuel markets. And that is a huge benefit. Again, it's around certainty and it's around sort of durability of these new policies and the impacts that they'll have on families in across the country and across the income spectrum. So it's a great point that you made, and I just wanted to reinforce that.
Yeah. And I just think the last thing that's really, timely to talk about as Hurricane Ian is looking at Florida and where folks are preparing, is we'll now have the opportunity to put solar panels on schools, and those become, shelters during a storm. Those become places that, are safe for folks that are not able to evacuate, which is really critical. But the rest of the year, the benefit is amazing as well, because the cost savings means we can spend taxpayer dollars on teachers, on resources and programming for students, rather than on paying the electric bill. And I just, as a mother, as a, neighbor in Florida, I think really looking at how we can lift up across the board is just, the highest and best use of our time here at EDF. And so I'm really, really excited about that piece. And I'll just maybe start to close by saying that, this relationship between how these federal policies will be enacted, they really are in a lot of ways implemented in the states. Like Congress passed a law. At that point, the agencies may do some administering of the funds, but how the dollars get spent really becomes state decisions. I was really excited to work with the Florida Department of Transportation to get to support them in their submittal for transportation planning. They're potentially going to get $29 million to cover a $200 million plan that the state already had been working on developing. And so how, I see EDF's role is really making sure that we're here to connect the dots. How will local governments, school boards, state government agencies really be able to take advantage of these opportunities so they can deliver them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say that the implementation is a huge part of whether this is as successful and as powerful as it can be. We've talked a lot about all of the different interconnectivity of the benefits of this, of these two laws and all of the funds that are available. And EDF, we're going to be working really hard to make sure that those dollars are used as effectively and efficiently and as equitably as they can be. So that's a big part of our work coming down the pike. We're not done yet. We need to make sure now that we've secured these policy changes, now that we've secured these funds, that we can use them to fight climate change. EDF is going to be working really hard to use these investments to make sure that they create tangible benefits for families, for communities, and that we can fight climate change as efficiently as possible.
It is really exciting to be in this time and doing this work and having the support of great minds like yours and our other colleagues at EDF and in the movement. Where can we go for more information if folks watching here really want to dig in? Do we have some resources?
Well, I would always direct people to edf.org, our website, which has lots of information, gives a lot of factual information about climate change and some of the policies that we've talked about today, and also suggestions for how you can be more involved.
That's great. And I think for folks here in Florida, if you want to kind of get more of the day-to-day stuff, you are welcome to join us and sign up for our Florida newsletter. We'll put the link below on the Florida Climate Week chat to make sure that's available to everybody so we can continue to answer questions as they come up and try to be a resource. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your time.
This has been fun. Thanks, Dawn.
Have a good day.